Right now, you're sitting somewhere warm. You probably haven't thought about that once today. The heat is just there, and you don't notice it until it's gone. But about 30,000 years ago, your ancestors were standing in the middle of what is now France or Germany or Siberia, in temperatures that dropped to negative 30 degrees Celsius, with no central heating, no insulated walls, no synthetic fiber. And they didn't die. They didn't retreat south and give up. They pushed deeper into the cold, and in some cases, they thrived. Which raises the obvious question: how? Because surviving that kind of cold isn't just about grit. The human body isn't built for it. We don't have thick fur. We don't hibernate. Our surface area to body mass ratio makes us genuinely bad at holding heat. So what was actually keeping these people alive? The first part of the answer is fire, but not in the simple way you're probably imagining. Fire for warmth is obvious. What's less obvious is how these people actually managed fire over long periods in unpredictable terrain. By around 400,000 years ago, there's solid archaeological evidence that hominins were controlling fire deliberately. Sites like Kizum Cave in Israel show repeated, structured fire use, same spots used over and over, bones and ash in consistent patterns that suggest routine. But maintaining fire in a frozen environment is genuinely difficult. Wood has to be dry. Tinder has to be gathered and stored before you need it. Wind kills a flame fast. Researchers studying these sites have found evidence of fire-starting kits, collections of flint and iron pyrite kept close to sleeping areas, which tells you something important. These weren't people who occasionally stumbled onto fire, they were managing it the way you manage a resource. Then there's the shelter question. You can have fire all you want, but if you're sleeping in open air at negative 20, fire only does so much. What researchers have found across multiple Ice Age sites is a consistent pattern of using natural features, rock overhangs, cave mouths, low ridgelines, combined with constructed windbreaks built from whatever was available. At a site in Ukraine called Mezhirich, dating to around 15,000 years ago, archaeologists uncovered something genuinely surprising. Structures built from mammoth bones, walls made from stacked skulls and femurs and jawbones, fitted together with visible intention. The largest of these structures used bones from at least 95 individual mammoths. That's not scavenging. That's large-scale planning and probably coordinated group effort. These weren't temporary overnight camps. They were semi-permanent winter bases. Here's something that doesn't get enough attention. The cold itself may have actually pushed certain cognitive developments forward, not caused them directly, but created the selective pressure that made planning ahead matter more. A paleoclimatologist named William Ruderman has spent decades studying how Ice Age cycles correlated with shifts in human behavior and technology. His argument is that the populations that survived repeated glacial periods weren't just physically tougher. They were cognitively more sophisticated because the cold environment punished short-term thinking harder than any other environment could. You can survive one bad day in the tropics. In a glacial steppe in January, one bad day means you're dead. The populations that made it through were the ones who planned, cached food, built real shelter, and organized in groups. And that brings in one of the most underappreciated survival tools early humans had. Other people. There's a researcher at the University of Utah named Dennis Bramble who has studied human endurance physiology for years. And one of the consistent findings in that whole field is that humans are unusually good at cooperative survival compared to other primates. Not just cooperative hunting, which gets a lot of press, but cooperative warmth, group sleeping, shared shelter construction, collective fire management through the night. A single human body puts out roughly 80 watts of heat at rest. Put 10 people in a small enclosed space and you've just added 800 watts to the room. That's not nothing. That's meaningful in a freezing environment. And the social structures that made this possible weren't accidental. They were built over generations. Clothing has to come up here because it's central to the story. The lice evidence puts consistent clothing use at around 170,000 years ago, but the cold climate-specific developments in clothing came later and they were remarkably sophisticated. At sites like Sungir in Russia, dating to around 34,000 years ago, archaeologists found burials that gave an unusually detailed picture of what people were actually wearing. The placement of thousands of ivory beads around the bodies showed exactly where clothing sat on the body. Researchers were able to reconstruct entire garments from the bead patterns. These weren't simple wrapped hides. There were tailored trousers, fitted upper garments, boots with decorated cuffs. Someone had developed a system of cutting and stitching that produced layered, close-fitting clothing, which matters enormously for cold survival because loose clothing traps less warm air than a fitted layer worn close to the skin. The bone needle shows up in the record around 50,000 years ago, and it's one of those small objects that completely changes the survival math. Before the needle, you can wrap yourself in a hide. After the needle, you can wear one, you can sew multiple layers together, you can close gaps at the wrists and neck where heat escapes fastest. A group of archaeologists studying cold stress in modern traditional communities in Siberia found that fitted multi-layer clothing reduces heat loss by something like 90% compared to a loose single wrap. The needle didn't just change fashion, it changed whether people could survive winter at all at high latitudes. Food storage is another piece of this that gets underplayed. One of the persistent myths about Ice Age hunter-gatherers is that they were always moving, always chasing the next meal. The evidence doesn't support that, especially for winter. At multiple Siberian and Eastern European sites, researchers have found what are essentially natural freezers, pits dug deliberately into the permafrost, filled with butchered animal remains. The cold preserved meat for months. This is the same logic behind your refrigerator, except the refrigerator is the ground itself. At the Yana RHS site in Arctic Siberia, dating to around 32,000 years ago, which makes it one of the oldest known human settlements above the Arctic Circle, researchers found evidence of exactly this kind of long-term food caching. These weren't people who wandered into the Arctic and got lucky. They had a seasonal strategy, and food storage was core to it. Fat was critical in a way that's hard to overstate. This is something modern nutritional science has come back to after decades of treating fat as a problem. For people living in extreme cold, dietary fat isn't optional. Your body burns fat to generate heat through a process called non-shivering thermogenesis, where brown adipose tissue converts calories directly to warmth rather than movement. The animals available in glacial environments, mammoth, woolly rhinoceros, aurochs, steppe bison, were all high-fat animals. And the archaeological evidence shows consistent preference for the fattiest parts of the carcass. Skulls were cracked open for brain tissue. Long bones were smashed for marrow. This wasn't random, it was deliberate prioritization of the most calorie-dense, heat-producing food available. Your body in cold weather doesn't just want more calories, it wants fat calories specifically. There's also a physiological adaptation angle here that most people don't hear about. You might assume ancient humans were physically identical to us, just living harder lives. But a physical anthropologist named Timothy Weaver at UC Davis has studied skeletal variation across cold-adapted human populations and found consistent patterns. Shorter limbs relative to torso size, wider nasal passages that warm and humidify cold air before it reaches the lungs, denser bone structure in populations that spent generations in glacial environments. These aren't dramatic mutations, they're gradual shifts that accumulated over thousands of years of natural selection. The people who survived multiple generations in the cold were slightly better built for it than their ancestors had been when they first arrived. Knowledge transmission is probably the most underappreciated survival factor of all. Think about what you actually need to know to survive a severe winter in the Siberian steppe. You need to know which plants are still nutritious under snow and where to find them. You need to know animal migration patterns. You need to know how to read ice for travel. You need to know the specific techniques for tanning hide without cracking it in cold air. None of that is instinct. All of it has to be learned and passed down. A research team studying knowledge retention in modern traditional Arctic communities found that the practical knowledge base required for cold survival encompasses thousands of individual skills and facts, most of which can only be transmitted through direct demonstration and years of apprenticeship. The groups that survived weren't just the strongest or the most physically adapted, they were the ones who successfully passed information across generations. There's evidence from the Denisovan and Neanderthal record that even our evolutionary cousins were developing cold-specific adaptations and strategies independently. Neanderthals, who ranged across Europe and Central Asia through multiple glacial periods, had body proportions almost perfectly matched to cold stress models. Short and stocky, with large nasal volumes, reduced surface area. They were also making ochre-tanned hides by at least 50,000 years ago. A site in Spain called Cueva de los Aviones shows Neanderthal use of pigments and decorative shells, which might seem like an odd detail in a conversation about cold survival, but it connects to the same social cohesion argument. Groups that maintained ritual and identity were groups that stayed together, and groups that stayed together were groups that shared warmth, labor, and knowledge. By around 20,000 years ago, during the Last Glacial Maximum, when ice sheets covered most of northern Europe and temperatures were at their lowest, modern humans weren't retreating. They were living in places like southern France and northern Spain, producing the cave art at Lascaux and Altamira. They were in Siberia, at Yana. They were ranging across mammoth steppe environments that no longer exist on Earth. And they were doing it with multi-layered tailored clothing, semi-permanent bone-built shelters, stored food, communal sleeping arrangements, managed fire, and accumulated generational knowledge about how to keep a group alive through the worst months of the year. The cold didn't stop them. In some ways, the evidence suggests it's sharpened them, pushing toward more sophisticated technology, tighter social organization, and more careful long-term planning than warmer environments demanded. The extreme cold was a filter. The ones who made it through were carrying everything their ancestors had figured out, and they just kept building on it.